should be going. Colum, take it away.
Yeah, so, well, good afternoon or good evening, good morning, depending on where people are. It's an online conference. I myself, I'm in Sydney at the moment. You can probably just see there on my slide. What I'm going to talk about has come from Macquarie University. It's part of my PhD that I did a few years ago. And you can see the heading there, Global English Ideologies and Communities, Exploring Perspectives from a Group of Korean English Language Users. I'm just to give you a small background, somebody has asked about this before. You can see my name, there's Colum Ruane, but it also has in brackets Ruane. It's how you pronounce that. And it's just the Irish language version of my name. So the one that's not in brackets is kind of the Anglican, like kind of the Anglo version of the name rather. And the other one is the Irish. So just putting that cultural aspect out there. But just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. So just a basic or some kind of light background in terms of English in the world and English in South Korea. And then the typical, just some insights to the methodology, findings, focus on global views and local concerns. And then in the conclusion, just wrapping up with a few points about the reality of English these days and tension within local contexts. But so just to start off with introduction, most people wouldn't argue too much that English is the most widely used and learned language in the world, as it has a unique role in knowledge acquisition, formulation, and provision worldwide, which has led Saraceni to indicate that it is an unalienable part of the lives of the people who use it, so native and non-native. However, there has been a bit of contention, people may know of, highlighted with regard to its global spread. And notable among many of these arguments is Philippson's linguistic imperialism, which is one of the more widely used or widely known criticisms of English's spread. So basically it states that as English has become the international gatekeeper to education and employment and so on, a functional and symbolic primacy is reinforced basically at the expense of local agency and culture. And this can lead to new orders of socioeconomic hierarchization within local contexts. However, critics again of these imperialist views see them as too deterministic, falling short of a complex nature or the complex nature of English at a local level. And those views can, in a sense, disregard local agency. That's the imperialistic views can disregard local agency, rendering learners, in a sense, powerless in their language pursuits. So it's kind of, in a sense, assigning the way they might say use English rather than seeing their own local perspectives. Essentially, a macro level perspective, which is the imperialistic view, can overgeneralize and can be, in a sense, inadequate to examine how non-native English speakers, if that's the terminology we use, can transform English as a post-colonial language for their own pursuits. And in fact, another perspective on this highlights the existence of an internal hegemony whereby structures at a local level can internalize language practices that then perpetuate an English hegemony. So rather than that macro, it's even a local micro level hegemony, imperialistic hegemony. So in all, the role of the English language in any local context basically should be evaluated with respect to its local socio-cultural flows in order to really understand the unique social practices at play in understanding how the language is adopted there. So one such country that is quite interesting and has an interesting history with English is South Korea. So essentially globalization was a key turning point for Korea and its implementation of English learning across their country. So they basically had a strong intent of launching themselves onto the international stage, like coming out of the latter part of the 20th century. And English became that language for them to propel every aspect of their country onto the global stage. So English for them, from the higher ups, the people in control of what was going to happen, became a symbol of upward and economic mobility. But then also that those ideas trickled down into the the communities within the population. So it was seen as a key to global access. So this led to an intensity for English across the country and resulted in it being implemented across quite extensively across the education system. So this overall zeal for achievement and English resulted in the term English fever, you might have heard within the literature, within Korean society, in which there was an intense focus on the learning of English and how it basically could determine, as I mentioned, success, not even in the global perspective, but very much in a local perspective within Korean society. So TOEIC scores began to be associated with access to the job market, and even for access to universities and even to graduate from universities. And the private market for English also became a booming industry worth billions of dollars. So the prestige of English, you can imagine, became a significant factor where speakers who had good ability were lauded. So that means, Korean, local Koreans, while individuals who didn't have such ability engaged in self-deprecation. So, they weren't living up to the standards, what they thought should be a good English speaker. So any sort of level they had, they always saw it as I'm not good enough. I'm not as good as that person. And interestingly, a neoliberal ideology also gives an interesting viewpoint on how English can be understood within Korea. Basically, a neoliberal ethos requires the individual or any individual to endlessly engage in self-development. However, the lure of what English can provide can affect a constant raising of that so-called competence bar. Thereby, the value of English capital constantly increases, so they can never reach that level. So Cho, who has done quite a bit of work in this, underscores that linguistic ideologies within neoliberalism can confine people's choices rather than expand them. So basically, the promise of English can be an illusion, so that competence bar is always out of reach. However, Park indicates that within neoliberal ideologies, it is possible that the embeddedness of language in a social context is minimized, leaving only a standard, dedicated and committed English learner or user. So in the presence of global aspirations, so not in the local perspective, but global, the personal attributes of the language can become accentuated, creating an individualized global personhood. So it speaks to the individual experiences there. However, although English still carries some vivid images of the West, as many wouldn't disagree, it also has become a symbol of global culture and global vitality. Those links to neoliberalism and personhood. This can be noted in a number of Korean studies and also a number of other studies that have looked across it in many different contexts. But basically, English's use in the light of globalization has been linked to new expressions of identity. This has brought up many conversations about English user empowerment and English appropriation. In that, is it a native speaker language or everybody's language? And I'm sure you've heard our conversations before. This focuses on the context of use and English as a lingua franca. So when individuals are learning who exactly are their target speakers in their mind. So English is also being pinpointed as a medium for local and diverse cultural representation. This especially has been highlighted in terms of its use in the media and music, with numerous studies showing how it is used to disseminate new possibilities and interpretations of local culture into the world. So people viewing it, certain aspects of culture from a different context. Chan 2009, for example, indicates that how the use of English in Hong Kong pop music functions beyond Western symbols of culture and is rather used as a poetic device to express highly nuanced, localized meanings that can also attract an international audience. So with the use of English. With those kind of ideas in mind, the local and the global. So basically as well, social creatures, human beings, and we are complicit in the global process. We essentially create it and make it. However, our contemporary systems of communication and connectivity have exploded in the past years, I'm sure many would agree, and can be exemplified by increased virtual encounters, increased access to world media, and especially increased global mobility. And as Marlena indicates, the effect of this situation when indicating that, or emphasizes this rather, she emphasizes it, growth in trans world movement, both physical and virtual, allows people to culturally, psychologically, and ideologically engage with each other. So essentially, the movement of people and the sharing of ideas and culture results in a global system that is not static. So it's one that's in constant movement, constant flux, constant realignment. which comes about through our interrelated influences. So the increasing contact, sharing of information across many different, say, local contexts, if we define it that way. So within this intensified global idea, people definitely are faced with new realities. And it is here that we can look at people's experiences through a cosmopolitan perspective. So you might have heard this word as kind of a different way of looking at globalization flows. So, but while globalization does assume internationalism, the local perspective gets drawn into this idea a lot more and can become a significant point of departure for people when they're engaging with global ideas in the global world. As Beck, and that's Ulrich Beck, if you want to look up this, states that the either inside or outside that underlies the distinction between national and international is transcended by both inside and outside. So basically the local perspective is the global perspective as well. And people's experiences within the local perspective are also their experiences within the global perspective. So this can lead to reflexive globality, which is a critical stance and a constant realignment of one's position. So an individual engages with their environment through their own sense of self and experiences. So that's again linking back to that idea of global personhood. So people's individual experiences are highlighted a lot more, and also they can become a lot more empowered and engage in a sense of, have a critical stance about what's around them, especially in this case, obviously with the use of English. So with all this in mind, while many of the themes concerning English in the world are not new, it is essential to recognize how the environments in which speakers use the language evolve. So it is here that we need to recognize that new perspectives can emerge in congruence with the evolving environments of usage, and how, again, that recognition can inform how we understand not only new learners, but all users of English language, as we engage each other in a more visibly diverse global space. So that constant kind of realignment of what we experience every day. So it's within this idea, or within this frame, that I was interested to look at the English language in a contemporary view, and how we can draw new perspectives on its use and ideology, especially from the users engaged with it every day. So my main focus, or as I mentioned, the ideas I'm presenting today are coming from my PhD project, so which focused on, I'm just looking at it here, a group of Korean nationals' perceptions of the cultural framing and utility of global English. So within this project, I covered a lot of ground with participants. So aspects concerning globalization flows, influences, cultural aspects, like what culture feeds into globalization more than others, or who decides that, or what perspectives are around that. Issues of global English and global Englishes, and different aspects of identity, like global identities, that kind of thing, bicultural identities. So today I just want to highlight some points concerning their insights to the utility of English within the global context, so their views, and also the Korean context, and also some insights to their identity, sense of global orientation, and also how English can feed into that. But just a few points in the methodology. So it was a qualitative, so fairly simple in its approach. I did interviews and reflective journals, semi-structured interviews and reflective journals across a period of 8 months. So there were 7 South Korean nationals, all female. They were self-selected. There wasn't any focus on females, and between 28 and 30 years old, all studying majors of English. Okay, some findings. Okay, so English within the global context. So when I initially asked the participants about English's role within the world, responses had a strong emphasis on the notion of English being a tool or asset among many tools to be used to integrate or navigate around the world. Some of the key themes ways that they talked about it were a tool for global togetherness, a tool for global access, a tool for global information. And we can see this stand out in Caroline's comment over here. So I feel like when I'm using English, it can bring me closer to the world. I can meet people, and I can definitely think about working in many places outside of Korea. So we can see that focus there in the global perspective. But interestingly, in the responses, there was a strong focus on the global context. So as highlighted there with Caroline, rather than a specific local context. So generally that was the theme across their responses. So it wasn't necessarily a native English speaker context, but any sort of a context that has that global feel. And we can see this quite interestingly in Jen's comment there. She compares her reality of English when she was younger to when she got older and started using it. So she felt a bit of an idiot. She became more realistic. This is when she was traveling. People just use it normally with anybody. We collectively use it, native and non-native, and that makes us understand better, I think. So strong emphasis on the global idea of English, which is, I think, not something like too new across the literature, but it's interesting that the responses automatically just had that, natural feel to it. However, at the same time, while they did have that significant or have that emphasis on the global positioning of English, they also stress that it is not the only way to engage with or gain an understanding of the world. So increasing technological means, increasing visibility of other languages, lending to information increasingly available in many other languages were standout points. So increased mobility online and offline, you could frame it that way. We can see this in Caroline's comment again here, in which she highlights how the internet allows us to connect, say, a lot more. So English plays an important role, but the internet and technology allows us to connect, and we know more in many ways. I think this kind of access gives people an open mind, and this is really the key to globalization there. So kind of not really a significant link there between English and globalization, but just being a part of the process. It was generally expressed that that other means of navigating the world allow for more open-minded engagement rather than just relying on the expectation of English. And we can see here with Sayana in terms of how she talked about, say, the younger Koreans. So I think Koreans should have the ability to discover the world themselves and not feel forced to just use English. They might get the wrong concept about English and globalization. So their views on English overall, it wasn't like an either or. It's like, yes, English is important. It's the language we use, but at the same time, look, we have lots of many differences, and basically the world is a multicultural place, and that's becoming increasingly visible. So that's the way we should be engaging with it. That realization, rather, that it was quite interesting to have that in their responses. So English within the Korean context. So their perspectives are not too far from the literature. The participants commented that English is especially influential in terms of economic and social mobility within the Korean context. And interestingly, was spoken about in regards to it being a commodity within their context. So we can see this in Jen's comment with referring to English in terms of an addition to their spec, which describes an individual's, in a sense, say specification or CV, self-CV. So it is a quality that Koreans add to their spec in order to stand out from others. It is a measurement tool against other competitors, especially for companies. So it was also stressed by the participants that English has a significant influence in Koreans' lives. Generally, the responses had the sense of embeddedness of the language within their culture, which is quite interesting. So not really a sense of it being a foreign language being learned, but actually it's a language that's part of the culture, but it has this, in a sense, strong negative aspect to it, a dark side. So has this embeddedness of struggle. It was quite interesting. So there was a strong emphasis on English being a measurement tool for companies, as I mentioned, and also a measuring tool within society to measure off each other. So we can see this with Rachel's comment here. So this strong sense of prestige to the language. So Koreans are exposed to the idea that English is so important that it makes them think that if somebody has good skills, they kind of say, oh, your English is so good. You're so intelligent, you're so smart, even if they are not smart. English, in a sense, is just something to show off. So it has a power. A lot of their conversation around English focused on this idea of power, or it has a power within the Korean context that people that have these abilities can, supersede others in a sense within, social hierarchy. But at the same time, well, they had a strong tension. There was a tension between this local and global idea as well. It was basically between, you know, the education system. So as an outcome of, or this tension, they talked about an outcome of an outdated education system within Korea. So there's a disjoint between what the Koreans receive and what they need in terms of value English in the world. So it was expressed that English education in Korea is is generally more focused on the local competitive market, and it can lock Koreans into a very methodical approach to using the language. So it's a very, you know, has a very pragmatic focus to it, rather than this developmental aspect to it. So in terms of like reaching that global space, global area, or global, how say Koreans can engage with the global space. So Caroline highlights here in her comment, I'm not going to read it all there because I'm just being aware of the time, but basically highlights how a globally engaged Korean population that basically are stuck in a system that perpetuates antithetical motives towards what global English represents and what it should represent, or how in a sense is being advertised within the Korean system or country. So the reality doesn't reflect what they're receiving. So basically it was generally expressed by the participants that English has become a form of linguistic production where choice has been removed for them, and in which feelings of resentment can grow towards the language. And just a few insights into their identity when I talked about their identity perspectives. So interestingly, when initially asking them about global identity or citizenship, they was a somewhat confusing or vague concept for them. In a sense, they said, well, why would somebody think about being a global citizen or global identity? Like, is that something we have already because we're here on planet Earth? Which is quite interesting. You often hear about or read about in the literature about how do you gauge a global identity, but we're just part of the system anyway. We are global. But when just talking about their identities a little bit more, each participant focused on experiences from both local and global. In that experiences home and abroad continually inform their self-concepts. So being Korean was a significant part of how they would construct a global orientation, which in a sense echoes back to those notions of that individuated personhood. So Jen's comment here was very typical of how that was expressed. So I realize I'm proud of myself as being Korean and have admired the thought of being a global citizen based on the idea of being Korean. So I'm sure this would help to create a global citizen, the combination of Korean culture and the ideas of the global. So that local global mixed perspective. In Rachel's case, we can see here, although at first glance it might seem that she rejects a global identity, she's a strong focus on being Korean, but she aligns her identity more in terms of her personal experiences, which exist within Korean and international contexts. So although I still don't see myself as a global citizen because probably I feel a strong community solidarity as being Korean, I do see myself as a cosmopolitan person in that my identity has been constructed through my very personal experiences of myself rather than as a Korean. So that idea of like there's a local and then there's a global and then well, where do I lie? Her perspective here is more towards, well, it's individual experiences, like this idea, it's too concrete to have that local global idea. So cosmopolitanism does have that focus on individual experience, that local and global are pretty much the same thing. But interestingly, when asking the participants about English's role in this whole idea of being global, they all, to varying degrees, pointed out that English is not an essential element in carving out what a global identity might be or would be. English is not the central or overarching focus, rather a sense of global identity orientation is more self-ascribed through one's own experiences, which you can see comes out strong there in Rachel's point and also Yun there as well. Okay, so what can we take away from this? A few points. Well, what I could see, pervasive technological innovations are becoming a significant factor in everybody's lives these days, which can allow for evolving ways to consume or understand the world and relate to, say, a wider range of ideas and people. And I argue, as you can see from my project, that can lend to new ways of understanding many ideologies, but obviously here in this case, English. So different perspectives on viewing it. Also, greater social mobility can also bolster awareness of one's own voice. to express or interpret one's own sense of global orientation. So not just only online experiences, but also offline mobility can really situate people in a different way, or just from their own perspectives. So this can involve distancing from notions of a global identity or orientation, or whatever way you want to describe that, in terms of an elusive ideal, so that removal of English. Through more global engagement, rather, learners may not see themselves as deficient users of English, but are more conscious of how they are interfacing from their own experiences with the world, through their, say, a multitude of self-orientated means. So using their own culture, their own languages, that idea of translanguaging across different cultures and contexts. So English is not this forefronted idea of this is how I'm going to engage with the world. So learners are kind of realizing, well, hang on, I can use my own identity to do this. This orientation basically draws in many cultural orientated assets into their own worldview, which can also be interpreted as being, in a sense, everybody's plugged into this idea of an implicit cosmopolitan connectedness. So we have this idea that we are all connected. So we don't necessarily see uniqueness in the ways that we digest and understand the world. It is just already there around us, that local global perspective. But we can see this play out in the participants' views of the Korean context, the English language in the Korean context. So the tension that basically they describe, in that misalignments exist between the Korean English education system and the global use of English. So the English received is not the English needed. So rather the Korean education system should position an ideology of English that is a collaboration and not a conflict with the global world. And it should support an encouragement of global representation of language and learning that helps reconcile global local beliefs and attitudes. So this final point, to what degree are these notions visible in your learning, student or even social contexts, either by way of policy, which may reflect a more open or restrictive perspective on English learning, or in English learners themselves who may be displaying more outward orientations as everyday, outward global orientations as everyday identity markers. Okay, here are just some of the references. Thank you very much.
We are over time, but this is lunch. So, you know, we've got plenty of time to ask questions. And if I might, can I jump in with two quickies?
Please do, yeah. I know I went over time there.
Yeah, no worries. As I say, I told you at the beginning, we're running into lunch, so time is less of an issue for you. I noticed in the Korean names, most of them had Western names, and I've got no real experience with Korea, really. I've been there for conference presentations twice. Are they like Chinese, where they just adopt Western names when they're abroad, or do they actually have Western names? That would be the first question. And the second question is more of a kind of global thing. This year, with the whole Black Lives Matter and the backlash from the right wing and police spy cams, I noticed that the Korean K-pop online community really got involved in that by hijacking the right wing hashtags and URLs. Can you make some comment on that?
Well, yeah, the first one, I'll probably have to ask you to repeat the second one, but the first one about the names. Yeah, it's typical, I think, across many, as I see it, I'm more familiar with the Asian context in terms of English learning, but they see, especially the East Asian, they tend to take on English names. But that comes about primarily when they're in, say, elementary school and stuff like that. It starts off in the very beginning. They don't know any better. There's like, here's the name that now, here's your English identity. You're going to learn and use English that way. And so that's what I was talking about. Well, and we actually got into that a little bit in conversations with them, that and I guess is spoken about a bit more in the literature these days, that separation of, well, here's a local identity. This is your, in this case, Korean language and context and culture, but then here's your global one with English and so on. But now it's a bit, you know, they're kind of reaffirming, I guess, learners are like their identities as being locally constructed within a global context. And actually nowadays, a lot of Koreans would just be using normally their Korean name. They're not really taking on English names. So I've been out of the context for a while now. I haven't been in Korea for the last 4 years, but I didn't notice that kind of trend happening. But still, you do see it a lot. And something that kind of irks me a bit is even to say people might call it an English name, but then it might be a name that is European based. Right?
Could even be Seamus.
Yes, it could be.
Or Angus or something like that.
Exactly. Or even my name is not an English name, it's an Irish name, like derived from the Irish language in a sense. So, but then I see it sometimes, you know, if they're in a form, for example, it might say Korean name and English name. And it's like, well, is it an English name? So those ideologies are there within the context of the language being learned, but at the same time, the learners themselves have a different mindset towards their use of language, English language, and their own culture mixed in with that. So I think it's something to kind of continue research into those different ideologies and changing what influences that. Yeah. The second one, what was it about the use of online hashtags?
So this year, you know, obviously Trump had MAGA 2020, and then the backlash against the Black Lives Movement was the White Lives Movement, Blue Lives Matter. And then even some of the police departments had a URL where you could upload videos of people doing bad things so they could arrest them. And the K-pop online community got involved into hijacking this and rickrolling them all by actually putting in things in the hashtag that redirected to K-pop videos to dilute the negative effects of these hashtags. And that struck me as like quite a weird thing, because obviously the K-pop community must have a certain facility with English to understand what was going on in the first place. They obviously had a certain knowledge of the human rights global situation, and they got involved in huge numbers that effectively made these right-wing semi-fascist hashtags unusable.
Yeah, but the thing is, even though, and this might be for many, again, the East Asian countries, even though they can't, you know, and it's written about a lot, they can't speak English very well, you know, within a conversational sense. They do have a high capacity for English in that they can write and they can read something and understand it quite well, you know, high levels of vocabulary and stuff like that. So to read things online or to soak in or to know what's happening online, you know, wouldn't be too troublesome for the majority of Koreans, younger Koreans especially. But also with K-pop, K-pop is a monster. It's a global monster at the moment of any, say, music industry or any sort of cultural institution. K-pop is kind of nearly the #1 in the world at the moment. So they're in every country. So it's kind of, and I remember having this conversation with my supervisor, who was Philip Benson. I don't know if you know him, you know, he's retired soon, but he was talking about, well, K-pop is not something, or Korean culture, it's not something that's, you know, oh, here it is, part of, it's basically, it is the global there. It's just part of the mix anyway. It's not just something to the side or peripheral. So, and I think like this, what you're talking about now is like how that's just the global framework we're with now, the paradigm. It's just, we're all just mixed up and people are engaging with each other on that level. You know, so it's not like the global idea or the hashtags of Trump or those other right wings are here, and then we have these people just merging in, like the Koreans. It's like that's just all there at the moment, and I think that's just what, in an institutional sense, for like language teaching, I think they're catching up, or you know, slowly catching up with those ideas. How the students within their class, how they are actually engaging with the global world and use of language and their own use of culture within those contexts. So especially language learning outside of the classroom, language use outside of the classroom. And I think all of that kind of stuff, you know, lessons that could engage with those ideas, using hashtags, using all that kind of stuff, engaging with world media, you know, could be developed a lot more now. I don't know exactly how that's happening, but I think that's something that will be in the mind of, you know, just developing new programs, because I guess it does take a bit of time to develop those ideas and get the top down, get the people, you know, agreeing to change those directions within the curriculum. But yeah.
Anybody else got questions? We've got a couple of minutes left.
Can I ask a question?
Fire away.
Hi, I'm doing research also on language ideologies, and I'm still struggling with how to define the ideology and what is a credible way to say that we can say that this exists and what students felt was an ideology. So I was wondering how you defined ideology, or you just kind of, it didn't really matter to have a strict definition for you. And I did also hear that when you gave your presentation, you said that perhaps they should have a certain global ideology? And is it possible to say that someone should have an ideology? Isn't it something that just exists? I was wondering if you could address some of these issues.
Yeah, actually in mine, I didn't actually highlight, I didn't give a definition of ideology. It was more just approaching it. What are these participants' perspectives or insights to the global use of English? So I didn't actually attach a definition or talk about ideologies within my project.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to get a couple of, if you know Ingrid Pillar, or like I had the reference there of Cho, if you remember the one in reference to Korea. If you go back and view the list of references, Jean Cho or Ingrid Pillar, they have done a lot of work specifically in ideology, and they give actually really good definitions. Okay. But actually, yeah, it's actually something I was thinking of doing, but the idea or trying to give a proper definition of ideology is quite tricky, I think. It's just like people's, like ideology is something that comes about through, information and how it's interpreted within a social community or that kind of thing. Like people can have different ideologies about the same thing, but then where do they get their information about that from? It's just like their circles of communication. So it's a tricky one, yeah. But I didn't really address that question specifically in mine. I just looked at their perspectives. I just kind of used the word ideology in my title of it.
Thanks for answering my question. Can I ask though, I noticed your YouTube video on the site, but that came almost at the same time as your presentation started, so I didn't have a chance to watch it. So are your slides the same in that video? Because you just now, if you go back to your slides, but I don't know where the slides are.
Yeah, no, it should be the same video, but for some reason I thought it didn't, the video wasn't working when before I just came in here, but hopefully I'll contact them and hopefully it's up working. But yeah, it's the same presentation, the same slides.
Okay, so I'll just look there.
Yeah. Colum, you know that on the JALT site, underneath your presentation on Eventzilla, there's something called presentation assets. You can actually get your PDFs and things uploaded in there as well.
Yeah, no, I saw that. I went to it and it's blank. It doesn't have my, like, before a couple of weeks back or whatever, we had to submit a video of the presentation. I did that, but yeah, nothing's there. It comes up.
I haven't used it. Is there an upload button where you could just upload the PDF?
I'll have a look, but if not,
I'll checking around.
Yeah, I'll contact whoever, because yeah, it should be, have these available. Yeah, there's no problem with that. Yeah. What was your second question, Riza? You had something else there. I can't remember what you said.
Oh, I was I just noticed. It might not mean very much, but I did notice you mentioned one of your points in the conclusion was that we should, or the students should, change their ideology so that it's more global and inclusive. And I was wondering if it's actually possible to say that we should have a certain ideology. Isn't it something that it just is, we can't force people to have an ideology? So,
oh yeah, no, of course, yeah. No, yeah, exactly. Maybe just the wording was a bit incorrect in the conclusion. Yeah, it's not about like that would be like the opposite of kind of point of the presentation, like forcing ideologies onto people. I think it's more of an encouragement of people engaging in their own sense of what whatever issue it is they're looking at in English in this case, what their own perspectives are, and encouraging this kind of diverse idea of ideologies, rather than having a one specific focus perspective on the, say, English ideology in the world. That you like to say, if you looked at, say, some people's perspectives on English maybe 10, 15 years ago, they might say, oh, you need English definitely to be this global person, to engage globally with the world, or where people, English is this thing you need to have, and this Western centric focus around that as well. But that has dissipated a lot over the last couple of years through people's new experiences and new realities when they engage with people. So it's kind of this idea of ideology. I think it's this groundwork, or like bottom up kind of way of approaching it, that within the classroom, especially within institutions, how they're addressing that, in that we need to have this idea of the local perspective rather than this kind of foreign perspective of use of English. And a lot of work, actually, I've kind of read a few things, how people have done projects where they look at universities or different institutions and their how they describe this idea of globalization to their students, and then in their local language especially, and then they kind of look at, well, how do the students relate to that? And in many cases there's a disparity, there's a tension there. So what these institutions and universities are espousing is completely different, or just off par with what the students, their reality.
Right,
so
right.
I think it's that disjoint of ideology in a sense. So the students' ideology towards their use of English is quite different than these top-down kind of perspective or ideology on use of English, or globalization for that matter.
Right. I still struggle with the terminology in the sense that when I do my research, I hope I'm not going too far off, is that I feel the students have their own perspectives and beliefs which are influenced by ideologies. And I see ideologies as a set of systems associated with, for example, Korea or Japan, or the educational system there, or local communities. And so I just thought, yeah, it was a little confusing for me still. But
yeah.
I really appreciated your explanation, and the topic is very important.
Yeah, you should look up, I mentioned there, I didn't go into it exactly, but cosmopolitanism.
Okay.
It's actually a different framework at looking at globalization kind of flows or cultural flows. Ulrich Beck, I mentioned him there, Ulrich Beck, was a kind of a forerunner with those ideas. It's quite interesting looking into that cosmopolitanism. It's not like, obviously we've heard of the word cosmopolitan just in everyday talk, everyday speech, but it's actually quite different. The use of it in this case is actually quite different in kind of defining or a kind of a frame of reference in understanding globalization. It's quite interesting to look, and I think that will give you a better grounding in terms of looking at ideologies or reframing how, you know, an ideology of English can be looked at.
Okay, great. I didn't know that. Thank you very much.
I'm going to have to end this here because in about 2 minutes, the next host is going to come in to get set up for the next sessions, because we've gone about, I don't know, 18 minutes over time, but it was lunch, so I just let it run on. So thanks for a good talk. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'm going to stop the recording here.
Sure.